In the short history of man's world, one device of war has accompanied him in every respect from the very beginning. Once man moved from hunter-gatherer to crop grower and farmer, he needed somewhere permanent to live. A place to store his grain, a corral for his herds, and a secure place for his belongings. From that moment on, he required some way to protect his property, a form of fortification. From the beginning of civilization, forts, barricades, and battlements were an intrinsic part of the world. Some of the oldest defensive structures still remaining date back to the empires of Assyria, Egypt, and Greece. Tales of battles and sieges adorn ancient carvings, tapestries, and manuscripts. Empires rose, conquered territory, built their forts, and asserted their power until the next great power arrived, usually with better technology. Some empires lasted 1,000 years, others a few short hundred, like the Persians, who ruled the largest empire in the Near East at the height of its wealth, sophistication, and glory.
We've called it forgotten because it's really been forgotten about in the West, not of course by the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it's been forgotten in contrast with other civilizations like Assyria, Babylonia, Greece, Egypt, and so on. And it was a huge empire, lasted for 200 years, and it really ought to be much better known than it actually is.
Dating as far back as Neolithic times, communities built hill forts to defend themselves. Maintaining high ground was an advantage. They built palisades of sharpened timbers as barriers, and beyond them, ditches to hamper any assault. These are still evident today. The Scottish broch dates back to the Iron Age, 1 century BC. Once the expansion of the Roman Empire reached England, indigenous peoples were forced north and west to the highlands and mountainous regions. The Romans, unable to defeat these tribes of Picts and Welsh, drew the dividing line of their empire literally by constructing fortifications like Hadrian's Wall. Of course, the Chinese Qin Empire had the same idea, but on a much grander scale. The Romans were astute fort builders, often utilizing the foundations or blockwork of earlier builders, continuing and elaborating on their work. This was partly because the placement of forts and castles to defend territory or overlook terrain had well been understood. The placement of forts often depended on the terrain: high ground, rocky outcrops, commanding positions. Defensively, forts and castles were places of refuge and needed to be large enough to accommodate many. But as offensive bastions constructed in enemy territory to influence and control regions, they became the centers of power. Regional rulers would make them their place of abode, and the castle was born. True castles began to be built in the late 800s. These included wooden and stone structures, often built on Roman structures and fortifications. Generally, these structures consisted of residential halls and rooms built of timber, surrounded with a protective wall, usually of rock and stone. Some examples of this early medieval castle design survive in Italy. The realm of the Franks then dominated the times under the Carolingian dynasty and set about enforcing their rule with forts and defensive works, all under the control of royalty. Due to invasion from Vikings and Magyars and the decline of the Central Empire to defend them, more towns and monasteries began to fortify. More castles dotted the European landscape. Their central timber halls were replaced with stonework and slate roofs. As the feudal system emerged, castles began to focus local power and authority in their regions of influence. England became aware of these structures in the early 11th century, with their conquest by the Normans, who brought castle construction with them. Throughout Europe and China, strongholds and feudal palaces sprang up. The earliest record of a castle in Britain is contained in the Bayeux Tapestry. One prominent form of castle design in Britain, Ireland and France of the 11th century was the relatively cheap and easy to construct motte and bailey. These were effective at repelling smaller attacks. Basically, a mound of earth taken from a ditch forms a small hill, where a keep is constructed either of wood or later of stone. A wall surrounds the keep from within the ditch's realm. The bailey is an enclosed courtyard, usually surrounded with a palisade or wooden fence and overlooked by the motte. Castles could have more than one bailey. The bailey would often contain a hall and living quarters for servants or farmers, and stables. It would also be connected to the motte with a drawbridge. The keep was the central tower, usually built on the motte, and served as the final redoubt in defence. It was often the accommodation for the owner, but could also function as a secure storage area or even a prison. One of the more famous prison keeps is the Tower of London. Situated on the Thames in the centre of London, the keep now houses the crown jewels. Some early castles were simple towers surrounded by a wall, the enclosed court area or bailey delineated by the enceinte or interior walls. It was often topped with a walkway around the outer wall for defence. The weakest point of any castle was the main gate. This was remedied with a gatehouse and some form of removable or drawbridge, doors and portcullis. Sophisticated gatehouse designs enable a defender to trap an enemy within the gatehouse and attack them with arrow and spear from slits in the walls called murder holes. Later fixtures to castles were machicolations built into the stonework overhanging the outer walls. Hot liquids or stones could be dropped on an enemy. The most familiar castle design element is the crenellations and merlons. They are the regular gaps in the battlements along the top of outer walls, allowing for archers to fire down at an enemy, then step aside for full protection behind the merlon. Armies and attacking forces had to overcome these castle battlements and defences. This led to the science of the siege engine. The earliest and most primitive of siege engines was the battering ram. The Spartans used a battering ram at the siege of Plataea in 429 BC. The tortoise was used to fill in a ditch to allow more direct access to the walls or gate. Later rams were enclosed with an A-frame roof to defend against arrow or stone attack. The device was wheeled up to the gate and ramming commenced. The catapult was the second to come into use, flinging rock or flaming debris at or over the walls. Scaling ladders were popular with the Greeks. The Carthaginians used siege towers against the Greek colony in Sicily. The Romans preferred to assault by way of earthen ramps built up against the wall, protecting their workforce with shields. Ancient siege artillery evolved in the form of gastraphites or the bolt thrower. The Chinese favoured the giant crossbow. The catapult, the ballista and the trebuchet all utilised mechanical energy to enhance their power. In an attempt to stop the medieval weapon technology slipping away, enthusiasts have built a functioning trebuchet, in fact, the largest one in existence. The giant catapult, weighing 22 tons, is modelled on those used in warfare 700 years ago and can fire boulders and other projectiles with almost pinpoint accuracy over 200 metres away.
We wanted to bring something here that didn't exist in the UK. There is no currently fired trebuchet in England at the moment, and we wanted to bring something here that would capture people's imagination, bring a piece of history to life, and that was commensurate with the size and scale of the castle itself.
The trebuchet has 300 pieces. They were made in Britain and painstakingly assembled on site by hand over a 5-week period. It was here that those behind it found out if all their calculations and efforts on the trebuchet had worked out.
We work in a yard in Wiltshire and we build everything basically in 2 dimensions, so you wouldn't have the whole thing together until you put it up on site. And so that was a crucial bit, actually putting it together on site. We hand erected using ropes and blocks and tackles. And that's the crunch part, is when you find out if everything's going to fit and it's going to match in together.
2 wheels on the trebuchet are turned to bring down its giant arm, which has 6 tons of stone in its base. The trebuchet then uses gravity to propel giant projectiles. It's hoped the giant siege machine will demonstrate how past technology was used as part of the armory of medieval warfare. During the Crusades, European castle builders got to see many new and innovative ideas in the construction of fortifications by the Byzantines. They took many of the ideas back to Europe and Britain with them. Among the new designs were geometric and mathematical layouts, projecting towers regularly spaced along the outer walls. These could be either round or square. Additional defensive walls inside the primary enceinte surrounded the keep. Eastern design influence expressed itself in tactics as well. Unlike the West, they considered each encircling wall to be a fortress unto itself, the keep being the last refuge of the garrison. Each component of the castle could also assist the other in their mutual defense with crossfire and enfilade. With these developments, European castles began to take on dissimilar appearance, their construction unique to their conditions, local materials and function. Richard I of England built the fortress Château-Gaillard-les-Andelys. The design consisted of 3 enceintes built on high ground, was merely a tower attached to the innermost wall. It was found that round towers withstood sieges better than square or sharp-edged towers, which could be undermined and collapse more easily than smooth-walled round towers. Frederick II built a castle that had no keep at all, just an octagonal-shaped wall with a tower at each point connected by the outer wall. The walls of Constantinople gave more innovation to castle builders, with concentric battlements one within another, particularly on flat or open ground. These could withstand siege as well as the inaccessible castles. During the late Middle Ages and the increase in military excursions, the need grew for more castles built in hostile lands. Edward I of England went to work in a campaign of castle building in Wales. Frederick II in southern Italy reused existing structures placed there by the Normans and Byzantines. King Denis I in Portugal, Philip I August of France, the Teutonic Knights in Prussia and Poland. The German nobles built their castles utilizing waterways as a line of defense. In a clearing in a small forest in France's Burgundy region southeast of Paris, a group of people are attempting to build a 13th century castle from scratch, utilizing only the local materials and tools available to builders in that time. There are no cement mixers or power tools. This is Guédelon, a typical French medieval château fort being built using the techniques, materials and rules of the 13th century.
Les gens qui sont à l'heure actuelle tailleurs de pierre, c'est le cas de certains qu'on a ici, charpentiers. Je crois qu'il y a un truc qui est très excitant pour eux, c'est de travailler manuellement, sans avoir affaire à des meuleuses électriques, du matériel électrique, avec de la poussière partout, etc. C'est de se remettre en état de métier à sa genèse, quoi. Et donc je pense qu'effectivement ça intéresse beaucoup de gens. Je crois que ce qui intéresse aussi le monde, c'est de travailler en équipe. C'est qu'en fait, entre l'arbre qu'on abat, qui est équarri, qui va finir en pont dormant sur le château, il y aura un certain nombre d'intervenants qui doivent s'entendre. Et donc c'est vrai que ça c'est assez bien, cette complémentarité, ça attire du monde.
It was in June 1997 that the first stone was laid. The last stone is expected to be in place in around 2025, according to current estimates. The plans for Guédelon were drawn up by a contemporary French architect and based on a typical 13th century chateau from the reign of Philippe Auguste. The chateau will be constructed around 6 towers, 1 for each corner and 2 for the drawbridge, with the emphasis on defence against any marauders. The day-to-day running of the site is based on the diaries of medieval builders that describe daily life on a construction site in the Middle Ages. Guédelon is a spectacular living history lesson. The siegecraft of the times was primitive, thus high, thick walls could cope with most onslaughts. However, this began to change with the advent of gunpowder and the cannon. In defence, castles began to incorporate additional wall slits to fire the new arquebus, and cannon and mortar were placed along the battlements. But very few, if any, medieval designs could withstand an attack with siege cannon. In 1414, Frederick I attacked the Friesack castle and reduced it to rubble in 2 days with his cannon. In 1415, Henry V's siege of Harfleur was completed with the use of prolonged cannon fire. The walls of Constantinople were breached in 1453 with a lengthy cannon bombardment by the Ottomans. In 1523, Nanstein Castle was ruined in 1 day of cannon fire by Philip of Hesse. The list goes on. Engineers and designers were tasked to find new methods of countering this cannon onslaught. Artillery towers were built at the angled junction of exterior walls. Tall towers and excessive merlons were removed. Walls became lower, thicker, curved and angled to best deflect shot. Earthenworks were built up to help defend the exterior walls. The Italian castle at Sarzana is a good example of this later castle development. Henry VIII of England also built a fine example at Deal. In 1750 in the Netherlands, the Bourtanga Star Fort is constructed and is probably the apex of cannon fortification. This design was defense in depth. The low angular walls with sharp angles gave cannon positions the ability to interlace fields of fire to all approaches to the walls, which were buried deep in the earth. Ditches and trench work were developed further to slow the approaches to the walls, allowing time to bring cannon to bear where needed. However, the advent of gunpowder was the beginning of the demise of the traditional castle. Castles acquired a secondary role as residences or blockhouses in mountain passes or storage for military stockpiles. The castle as a feudal garrison and centre of power was done by the 16th century. However, this did not mean the death of castle construction or design. Estates and residences free from the design constraints of a defensive fortification were to revisit the tall, elegant towers of earlier centuries. A fine example of this is the castle Neuschwanstein. However, the castle as a bastion of power still existed in the New World, where the superior military and technological forces of the European powers maintained a lead over the indigenous peoples of America. Fine examples are the Spanish forts of Central America and the Caribbean. Castillo de San Marcos in Florida was built in 1672 to replace smaller timber fortifications defending the city of St. Augustine. It is a masonry star fort layout designed for cannon defence. It is low and much is below ground level. It saw use through several wars and changed hands many times. The timber palisades and forts erected by American colonial and later military forces in their expansion across North America and Canada served the same basic principle as the feudal castles of Europe: to dominate a landscape and project their power over a region. It is only because the indigenous Indians lacked the firepower, i.e. siege cannon, to fight this intrusion that they succeeded. A case in point to the reverse was the events of the American stand at the Alamo against Mexican cannonade. The introduction of the exploding shell added another level of complexity and difficulty to the defending of a fortified position. One answer was trench work dug outside the walls. Deep trenches too wide for a man to cross, but narrow enough to avoid direct artillery fire and afford some shelter to defenders. Modern artillery reshaped the battlefields of Europe. Firepower outweighed mobility. Fortification had nowhere to go but underground. Although trenches and earthworks had been used in warfare from the very beginning, these were usually minor or used for specific purposes, as in siege works and mining under enemy walls. It was the advent of conscription that led to the creation of large armies around the time of Napoleon, which enabled forces to use extensive trenching techniques to secure large areas of territory. During the Napoleonic Wars, and in particular the Peninsular War, which pitted Spain, the United Kingdom and Portugal against France in 1809, Viscount Wellington ordered the construction of an elaborate chain of forts, blockhouses, redoubts and trenches to defend the city of Lisbon. Called the lines of Torres Verdes after the region where the work was carried out, it stretched across the peninsula from the estuary of the Cisandro River to the sea. It was 3 lines in depth, with forts guarding the major roads. A total of 108 forts, 101 redoubts and detached batteries, and a total of 1,067 artillery pieces. A 4th line defended the rear of the city and was armed with 86 artillery pieces. These defences repelled several major attacks and withstood any enemy incursion. The British forces moved out in pursuit of the retreating enemy, never to return. The use of trenches and fortified blockhouses extended to the Americas and the American Civil War, where forts played an important role for both sides of the conflict. After the War of 1812, coastal forts were constructed along the eastern seaboard of the United States beginning in the early 1820s. Seaports along the eastern coast all had at one time or another a fort overlooking their entrance or approaches. Fort McHenry, Fort Carroll, Fort Washington and Fort Jackson, to name just a few. Fort Sumter defended the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, and is best known as the location where the first shots of the American Civil War were fired. The fort itself was a 5-sided brick construction with walls 5 feet thick and standing 15 meters above the low tide mark. Built to accommodate 650 men and 135 cannon, it was never filled to capacity. The fort was heavily bombarded and changed hands after a day. It was then attacked constantly for the rest of the war, being left in ruins by the end of the conflict. Fixed emplacements were set to guard major access points, such as the trenches at Fort Mill Ridge at the approaches to Romney and the south branch of the Potomac rivers. The Manassas Junction, Virginia, an example of open field works of the era. The siege of Petersburg, although strictly speaking not a siege at all, was another extensive use of prepared trenches and artillery placements. The war between Japan and Russia was to become the first modern war fought with extensive trench and fortified bunkers. The introduction of automatic weapons and accurate artillery fire helped convince combatants to dig down deep. World War I would have to be considered one of the most devastating, wasteful, and badly managed military campaigns of all time. Fought between 1914 and 1918 in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the open seas, it saw the advent of modern and mechanized weapons, machine guns, tanks, and aircraft, but utilized outdated and superseded military tactics and thinking. It was for this reason that the war in Europe quickly bogged down to a stalemate along the Western Front in the biggest and longest trench war of all. Stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border with France, a chain of trenches, pillboxes, and fortified strongholds were hastily dug and called the Western Front. Sandbag bunkers, artillery and machine gun nests, sniper positions and rear areas were connected by a series of trenches. Barbed wire and minefields often separated the two enemies by mere meters.
I attack!
For the entire war, attack and counterattack across what would be known as no man's land moved the lines back and forth just a few meters. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides lived and died in the most squalid conditions. They attacked each other's trenches with massed assaults, usually repelled by artillery and massed machine gun fire. Apart from constant barrage fire from artillery, mortar and bombs dropped by aircraft, the soldiers had to put up with rats, lice, nits, and disease from the mud-filled trenches they had to live in. Poison gas and rotting corpses made the matter unbearable for many. The ever-present danger of snipers kept the soldiers down in the trenches. In total, over 20 million soldiers and civilians died. Unrealized at the time, this was also the demise of static warfare. The castle and trench line were about to become a thing of the past. The Maginot Line, named after the French Minister of Defense after the First World War, was a concept not without its strategically thinking detractors. The French suffered badly during the war to end all wars and endeavored not to repeat such a calamity. They built a defensive line along France's borders with Germany and Italy. Their plan to invest so much time, money, and manpower into an impenetrable defensive line, instead of modernizing their depleted army and air force with new weapons and armor, was central to the debate at the time. Maginot won the argument. Built between 1930 and 1940, the line consisted of miles of underground tunnels linking fortified emplacements and pillboxes, artillery and anti-tank emplacements, communication centers, and machine gun bunkers. It was not, as the name suggested, a thin line of concrete bunkers, but in fact a defense in depth, with key forts, border posts, and infantry encasements to a depth of over 25 kilometers in some places. There were several kinds of armored cloches or bell-shaped steel turrets. Some were retractable into reinforced bunkers. They housed artillery, machine gun, and anti-tank weapons and grenade launchers. There were over 340 of these battlements along the line. In total, there were 142 ouvrages, 352 casements, 78 shelters, 17 observatories, and 5,000 blockhouses. The Maginot Line met up with the Belgian defense lines to the north and the Swiss border to the south. The Maginot Line was to be the first line of defense against another attack by Germany, designed to allow the French time to amass an army to repel any direct attack from the east. The German army took this into consideration when they attacked during the Second World War. They stationed a dummy force confronting the Maginot Line and proceeded to attack the Belgian fortifications to the north, which they overwhelmed quickly. They pushed into the Low Countries and then turned south, avoiding the Maginot Line altogether. The gun emplacements could only fire east and were useless. The Germans bypassed the entire defensive line and continued south through France and were only stopped at Dunkirk by the English Channel. The Nazis quickly established a network of bunkers and pillboxes along the coast of Europe, facing the English Channel. Later in the war, the Germans reinforced their coastal and harbour defences in anticipation of a seaborne invasion from Britain. As predicted by the First World War, air power came into its own in the Second, and the nature of military hardened bunkers had to change to accommodate this new threat from above. No location was any longer out of the reach of the enemy, who could drop large and plentiful bombs anywhere, anytime. No fortress wall could protect, so bunkers went deeper underground. The Nazis placed their most important industrial facilities deep underground. After successful bombing raids at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, they moved the V-1 and V-2 rocket production facilities to Mittelwerk in the mountains. It consisted of two main tunnels, 1.6 kilometers long, connected with a network of smaller tunnels under the mountain. Through the war and later into the Cold War, nations built extensive command bunkers as their commanders and decision makers. Prime Minister Winston Churchill lived below ground in his now famous secret bunker during the Blitz of London. In recent years, the war rooms have been opened to the public as a museum and exhibit of how Churchill and his staff lived underground during wartime over half a century ago.
The official side of the Cabinet War Rooms has now been extended to include my grandparents' bedrooms, their kitchen, their own dining room. It's also going to contain this great Churchill Museum, which I think will be a unique collection of Churchilliana, and will be a great addition for people to come through here and see the living history.
These rooms were small. Even the Prime Minister's wife Clementine had to make do with basic conditions. Churchill preferred to be above ground in number 10 Downing Street, but was often forced to take refuge and work underground.
He only came here when the bombing was very intense, and in order to be able to continue the business of government. And that was the whole point of this place, is it was solely for the purpose of the government being able to continue whatever happened.
In this conference room, Winston Churchill held his evening meetings with chiefs of staff. As they worked for Allied victory, there was room for humour too, at the expense of Adolf Hitler, before perhaps Britain's greatest Prime Minister went back to work. The German commander also had many command bunkers. A major one was 8.2 meters below the gardens of the Reich Chancellery building in Berlin. It was connected to an even older bunker system, the von Bunker, beneath and behind the old Chancellery building. At the fall of Berlin, Hitler and his wife committed suicide in the Führerbunker, effectively ending the war. In the nuclear age, new bunker designs set deep inside mountains and either resting on gigantic springs or hung from the roof by cables to absorb the shock of a nuclear attack became prevalent. Bunker design had to factor in the danger of nuclear radiation and fallout, the unseen killers able to penetrate meters of earth or concrete with their rays. They required thicker walls or deeper earthworks and complex air filtration systems, plus a stockpile of food and water. The Command and Control Center for the United States Air Defense and Nuclear Forces went underground at Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. A hollowed-out cavern contains numerous concrete block structures sitting on springs and connected by tunnels. Massive blast doors can seal off the complex in case of nuclear attack. Many others have built bunkers and blast shelters, including Castlegate Bunker in Germany as NATO Forward Command Center. Situated in Pennsylvania, the Raven Rock Mountain Complex, or Site R, is a US government facility 10 kilometers northeast of Camp David. Built underneath a mountain, it is considered to be the second or backup Pentagon and fields a massive communications facility for the armed forces. During the Cold War, the US government approached the owners of the Greenbrier Luxury Resort in the town of White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, to build an emergency shelter or bunker system to house the US Congress after a nuclear strike. Project Greek Island was commenced in the late 50s and included an underground kitchen, dormitory, hospital, and a broadcast center for Congress. Its very existence was denied until 1992. Hawthorne, Wiltshire is the site in Britain of a major complex of bunkers and fortified positions for military communications and intended as a command and control center for government in the case of a nuclear attack. Still relatively secret is the extensive bunker system under Moscow, connected to the very deep subway system. Other Warsaw Pact countries no doubt constructed elaborate bunker systems for their defensive use. In East Germany, several hidden bunkers have been unearthed in recent years. This bunker, with 8 rooms, was recently shown to the public for the first time, while renovation work on the former official office of East German leader Erich Honecker was underway. The site, known during Eastern German rule as Staatsratsgebäude, or State Council Building, is currently being transformed into a management school. The bunker, situated 6 meters below the building, includes elaborate electrical, plumbing and ventilation systems and has a 30-meter-long escape tunnel.
Also der Bunker hat eine Größe von 22 mal 10 Metern. Es gibt 6 Schutzräume, 2 Archivräume. Insgesamt sollten hier wohl 150 Leute Platz finden. Und der Rest sind eben Technikbereiche. Die 2 Räume, die Sie zuerst betreten haben, sind Schleusen und dann gibt es eine Notstromanlage, Sanitäreinrichtungen und eine Lüftungsanlage.
German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder had his offices there after the government moved from Bonn to Berlin in 1999 and before the newly built Chancellery in Berlin was finished.
Die sind für den Fall gedacht, wenn die elektrische Versorgung zusammenbricht, dass man eben die Möglichkeit hat, sich per Pedalkraft Luft zuzuführen.
Later, the Staatsratsgebäude was the temporary home to a part of Germany's foreign spy agency, Bundesnachrichtendienst. Those who knew about the bunker later called it Poison Kitchen, because after 1964, everything top secret was stored there, mainly files and documents.
Praktisch der Notausgang aus dem Schutzraum. Wir haben von innen gesehen, dass es dort eine Einstiegsluke gibt, dann einen Fluchttunnel und das ist praktisch der Ausgang davon.
According to building site manager Schnepf, there are plans to permanently seal the bunker for which there is no more use 14 years after the East German state ceased to exist. Only recently, another East German bunker turned up. The giant bunker boasts 300 or so empty rooms, which lie underneath the eastern German village of Prenden. This was where the head of the former German Democratic Republic, or GDR, and his colleagues were meant to hide themselves in case of a nuclear attack. The so-called Honecker's bunker, named after the former East German leader Erich Honecker, was opened to the public at the start of a 3-month visiting period before it is sealed up and closed for good.
Der ist für mich was ganz, ganz Besonderes, dieser Bunker in Technik, Architektur, im Zusammenspiel von beiden Kriterien, weil dieses Bauwerk wirklich einzigartig ist. Es ist nur einmal gebaut worden, zumindest auf dem Gebiet der DDR. Uns ist noch bekannt, dass es im Bereich der ehemaligen Sowjetunion errichtet wurde. Dieses Bauwerk ist so aufwendig von der Technik her und von der Architektur, dass wir wirklich sagen können, es ist zu kostspielig gewesen, auch für die DDR, das im größeren Stil zu etablieren. Und somit war es nur einmal hier wirklich in Bränden wiederzufinden.
The bunker was built between 1978 and 1983 and is one of the most modern protective buildings of the Warsaw Pact. It took a full 5 years to build the 3-story bunker and used up 85,000 tons of concrete. It was built to house nearly 400 people in the event of an emergency. Many parts of the building were built to hang from steel in the ceiling. Even the bunk beds could still be seen swinging. This was meant to prevent the bunker and its contents from falling apart in the event of a large explosion. A 250-meter-long tunnel links the bunker with the former headquarters of the National Defense Council, as well as a number of garages where special vehicles were kept to be used in case there was a nuclear strike. All precautions were taken in the building of the facility, including preparing electricity and air supplies, as well as a water tank with the capacity to hold some 350,000 litres of water. The bunker will be sealed in a way that means it can never be reopened, bringing to an end a piece of the country's history forever. In more recent times, amidst fear of North Korean nuclear missiles, a number of Japanese are looking into nuclear shelters for their personal protection. When Hiroyuki Mogi had his cozy log house built last year in western Tokyo, he paid an extra 12 million yen, some $100,000, to install an underground shelter that can protect his family from nuclear blasts. Mogi came up with the idea of having a private family shelter after seeing the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. Amid recent fears of North Korean missiles and its nuclear capabilities, Mogi is confident that he did the right thing.
4人家族で10日間を想定しています。
Inside his shelter are a top computer and an air purifier that filters out radiation particles. The Mogi family shelter was built by a Kobe-based precision machinery manufacturer. The company started selling nuclear bomb shelters to individual homeowners after North Korea first launched its missiles in 1998. Since then, it has sold more than 80 units. Since North Korea's latest series of missile launches, the shelter manufacturer's phone keeps ringing, as homeowners across Japan are anxious to know if they too can have private shelters installed at their homes. To counter military command centers deep underground, Western weapon designers need to find ways to defeat deep underground fortifications. Enhanced radiation weapons that could penetrate deeper into the earth or concrete structures with deadly neutron radiation were tested, killing only living tissue and leaving the physical structures about them untouched. New conventional munitions delivered by aircraft to penetrate reinforced concrete before detonating were designed and put to use in recent conflicts. During the first Gulf War of 1991, US forces learned of enemy bunkers deep underground and set about designing the GBU-28, a laser-guided bunker buster which consists of a 5-meter-long artillery barrel made of extremely hardened steel. Inside this barrel are 295 kilograms of high explosive. The bomb is fin-stabilized and capable of penetrating up to 20 feet of reinforced concrete or 100 feet of earth. Newer versions now have rocket-assisted penetration and depleted uranium warheads. Some are even nuclear-tipped. It would seem there is now no fortification capable of withstanding an enemy attack. Another form of defense is the landmine, a small explosive device buried underground close to the surface that can be triggered by nearby motion, tripwire, direct pressure, or remote control, and is usually placed in a large group or minefield to to deny passage of people or equipment from a certain area or channel enemy forces into a chosen zone. Minefields can also guard borders or beaches, roads or salient points such as the Korean Divide or Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, currently the world's highest concentration of landmines. The history of landmines goes back to pre-explosive days, when small pits were dug and hidden to catch a foot or break the ankle of an enemy combatant. These were enhanced with sharpened sticks, sometimes treated with a poison or rotten garbage. Caltrops were small iron barbs scattered on the ground to delay advancing troops. With the advent of gunpowder and explosives, the Chinese placed bamboo stalks filled with black powder and iron and buried in the ground. Some were triggered manually by a hidden assailant. Self-detonating bombs were described as early as 1277, some using a flint and wheel device to ignite the main charge once triggered by a passing soldier. In Europe, landmines were laid with tripwires connected to a snap-haunce or flintlock igniter. These were utilized in the defense of major fortifications. American Confederate troops built the first modern mechanically fused anti-personnel mines in 1862. Captain Rains had employed explosive booby traps against Indians in the Seminole Wars and developed the Rains mine. Over 2,000 were deployed by the end of the war. In 1908, Andrew Schaff designed the modern proximity landmine. There are many types of landmine, from anti-personnel mines that can be seeded from the air by artillery or aircraft bomb, to anti-tank devices and even nuclear landmines left by a retreating army. The British even developed and deployed gas landmines during the First World War. A landmine can be triggered by pressure, vibration, magnetism or sound. Modern mines have an anti-handling trigger as well, to stop anyone trying to move or disarm the mine. Modern anti-personnel mines are made of plastic with very few metal components, which makes them hard to detect with a metal detector. A typical mine would be set in the ground and, if a pressure-sensitive type, covered with light ground debris for camouflage. When stepped on, a spring-initiated firing pin would drop, hitting a detonator cap, not unlike a hand grenade, and trigger the main charge, injuring or killing the soldier. Modern designs opt to injure the soldier, disabling him, and forcing 2 or more other soldiers to carry or assist the casualty. One type of anti-personnel mine was developed by the Germans during the First World War. Called the S-mine or Shrapnellmine, it was the first of a category called bounding mines, and commonly known as the Bouncing Betty. This design was copied by the United States in the M16 mine and subsequent models. Copies in other countries function in the same way. Fitted with a sensitive vibration or contact sensor protruding from the ground, these could also be triggered by tripwire. When disturbed, a spring-loaded striker activates a firing cap and a pyrotechnic delay. This sets up a timing sequence to allow the intended victim to step off the mine. When the delay is burned through, a small black powder charge detonates and a second delay fuse ignites, shooting the main body of the mine up out of the ground to a height around 1 meter, where the later fuse ignites the main explosive charge, shooting ball bearings or shrapnel in a 360-degree spread and capable of inflicting injury up to 200 meters. Anti-tank mines are usually much larger and require greater pressure to activate. A person or light vehicle might not trigger an anti-tank mine. Modern anti-tank mines are capable of such magnetic sensitivity as to be able to distinguish types of vehicle passing by, and therefore only detonating when a known enemy vehicle passes, allowing friendly forces uninterrupted passage. During the First World War, the British even developed a gas mine, which, once disturbed, would deploy poison gas. The Soviet Union and the United States both developed such mines. Perhaps the most devastating is the nuclear landmine, left in the ground behind a retreating army and set to detonate when an enemy force passes. The United States still retains a small stockpile of such devices. Landmines have another negative effect inasmuch as they continue to do their job long after the conflict has ended. Millions of mines remain unmarked in the ground around the world and continue to kill and maim innocent civilians and children. International treaties and pressure groups, including the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, have sought to eliminate these devices from arsenals everywhere and to have existing minefields destroyed. The Ottawa Treaty of 1997 saw the prohibition of anti-personnel mines come into effect. The ban included the use of, manufacture or sale of mines as well as stockpiling. As of 2007, 158 nations have signed the agreement and 37 have not. They include China, Israel, Pakistan, India, Russia and the United States, who still maintain the Korean DMZ minefields.